Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the main stage of BCB 2019. Our next speaker, Camper English, will be presenting on Cocktail Safe. These days, there is just about nothing that a bartender has not tried to use in their cocktails in order to create new flavors and show off their innovative mixing skills. But just because you can add it to a drink, should you? In this era of envelope-shredding creativity, should we also be showing an abundance of caution? Creator of the first dedicated resource to help bartenders research the health implications of their cocktails, US-based author Camper English will look at some of the most misused ingredients and techniques. Please give a warm welcome to Camper English.
Hello. Hello. Can we get our screen out back on the slideshow? It's so bright up here, I can't see a thing. So you may have noticed the sound is really terrible on the sides, and even if you're in the back on the middle, it's much better. So if you want to hear better, the middle is the place to be. Feel free to squish in at any time. I'll let the new folks get settled, and then I'll get going. All right, everybody. Welcome to a thrill ride of danger over the next hour of me telling things that you shouldn't do, but it's more exciting than that. So this is Cocktail Safe. I am Camper English. I am primarily a journalist, but now I do a lot more speaking than just writing, and that's better because I know that people are, reading the words from my mouth. And my main website is alcademics.com, where I cover lots of nerdy things, a lot about ice on there if you've been, and links to other work and stuff. But we're here today to talk about the items that are on cocktailsafe.org. This is a website that I built after a lot of work, and it contains links to pages for probably more than 80 pages and several hundred ingredients that may or may not be safe, legal, or illegal. And everything I'm going to talk about today is available on the website. So as you're listening to the talk, don't need to write down any numbers that are on the screen or anything like that. If you just remember, like, hey, there's something about Thujone that I should be paying attention to, you can always go to the website and look it up. It's got far more information than I could possibly present in 1 hour. So check that out at any time. The Cocktail Safe was built in part with a grant from the Tales of the Cocktail Foundation. So I'd like to acknowledge that they provided a lot of the funds for giving me the time to do all the research. As well as, I'd like to acknowledge Avery Glasser, co-founder of Bitterman's Bitters, who did a lot of the early work on studying the dangerous ingredients and sharing detailed information more in a private Facebook group that I then wanted to be able to share with the larger world. So Cocktail Safe is the result of that. As mentioned, there are many, many ingredients that we might want to pay attention to, but we're only going to cover sort of the greatest hits, greatest hits of danger here at this talk at Bar Convent Berlin. One thing to keep in mind as we give this talk is that probably everybody here is going to find something on a slide that they did behind the bar that wasn't exactly a great idea. I mean, I have. I think we'll find we all have. And safety it's a spectrum. It's a goal. We really want to get to purely safe and purely legal, like we want to get to lime juice and simple syrup. But we're starting out with, tobacco bitters and stuff. So we have, a lot of us have a way to go, and pretty much everyone has room for improvement. So what we're trying to do is not say you're a horrible monster because you've done something that we can't guarantee is safe, but to examine a goal of being safer than we are right now. I won't say it's a no judgment zone, but it's a low judgment zone here from the stage. I will judge your fashion hostilely instead. So, yeah, poisoning your customers is bad hospitality. I feel like I shouldn't have to say that, but I kind of have to say that based on what y'all been doing. So, to encourage a low judgment threshold, there are a lot of places that you can find recipes and techniques out in the world that are terrible sources of information. And so it's quite easy to have stumbled across some of these and repeated what seemed like reputable recipes, but they turned out to be not such a good idea. So the back of the first edition of Jerry Thomas has that recipes for the manufacture of cordials, liqueurs, etc. And it's full of stuff that's toxic for you. We've got ammonia, we've got turpentine, calamus, which is limited, sassafras, many different things in that book. So we tend to hold vintage cocktail and recipe books and vintage distiller books as well as being good because it's old world. Those are sacred texts. Well, they're also full of stuff that you shouldn't actually do. So it's just a reminder to check the ingredients listed in old recipes with modern safety practices. However, even in some modern safety books, if the book was written by someone writing about just cocktails generally, but not by a botanical expert, they may get certain facts wrong, such as saying that bitter almonds have cyanide, but apricot kernels are fine. That is not true. And we'll get into that a bit later. That's one recent book. Another one says, well, the US government banned sassafras, but in my opinion, if you just use a little bit of it, you're probably not going to die. I mean, from a liability perspective, that was probably a poor choice for this author to have made, to recommend something that was shown by the government to be illegal, let alone unsafe. So, keep in mind, not every source is an expert source just because it made it into print. Now, a bigger issue, I think, because it's something I run into a lot. I'll see a recipe for a botanical used in a homemade bitters or vermouth, Amaro, etc., and I will look up the ingredients online to try to buy it because I may not have those offered for sale at a store nearby. And there's a lot of stuff for sale online that looks like it's made for food, but it could be made for potpourri because it has great scent. There's a lot of crossover between bitter and Amari ingredients and potpourri. Witchcraft. There's a surprising amount of stuff for sale for witchcraft. I've found stuff made for aromatherapy. Stuff made for herbal cures, which are often based on terrible science, and as we'll come to in the talk. So this is one example. This is sassafras, which in the United States is fully illegal. And the little disclaimer on the bottom, which you certainly can't read, it says, safety guideline for external use only. That's okay, true, because it's not okay to use. It says use with caution, avoid excessive or long-term use, not for use with pregnancy. So all the rest of that messaging was like, you're gonna put it in your mouth, and we know that. And they're sort of trying to cover their butts with the first statement and then tell you just not to overdo it with the other statements. So you're not gonna really get the proper safety information that you need from a lot of packaging. Another example of that, and I think a far worse one I run into a lot, if you go to buy tinctures or edible essential oils online, you'll find them labeled, oh, this is organic. And automatically we associate organic with organic food and assume that it's edible. Well, these are for aromatherapy, and they're definitely not. They may have a base rather than neutral alcohol of, I don't know, nail polish remover or something like that that's just not meant for human consumption. So we have to disassociate organic from edible. Poison ivy is organic, and you know not to eat that. Same for all these other ingredients. Okay. So also, as bartenders, I think we know that if there is a bad recipe that exists in the world, you can find it on the internet. And so you can find bad recipes for homemade ingredients and unsafe recipes as well. This is from Pinterest. I stole, it says homemade amaretto, and we see a jar full of what should be bitter almonds if it was proper amaretto. This would be enough cyanide in this jar to take out a small village. Definitely don't trust the internet automatically. And also, from a legal standpoint, the laws are different in different countries for ingredients that are approved and unapproved. And we'll get into some of those in just a second. So we're going to start about talking about dangerous ingredients used behind the bar. This is tobacco frog. Frog-bacco. I haven't named him yet. Maybe you can help me with that. So tobacco behind the bar, I haven't looked because Europe is a lot of countries and I didn't have time to look at every law. But certainly in the United States, the way the laws are written about serving tobacco is that tobacco must come with a warning label on it. So it's not legal to give someone a pinch of tobacco or sell an individual cigarette to a customer because it doesn't have the government warning label on it. And from my understanding of the law, that means you couldn't put tobacco in a drink and give it to somebody for exactly the same reason. But that's the legal reason. The real reason to not serve tobacco in beverages is because it's super poisonous to a greater extent than I think most people realize. Tobacco is a natural insecticide. It can cause conditions with the heart. Overdoses are easy to happen. So most of the time, when people are using tobacco in cocktails, they're using just dashes. And a lot of us say, like, it's one drop of tobacco bitters. What could the harm possibly be? Well, this comes into play that when you smoke a cigarette, if there are 20 milligrams of nicotine in that cigarette, when you smoke it, you're only consuming really about 1 milligram of that tobacco through that method. However, if you put that tobacco in alcohol, alcohol is very good at extracting flavors and everything else from botanicals, so you'll get the full dose of nicotine in the alcohol that you've used. So if we think about just a little shaker of bitters that we're shaking on top of the drink, 2 or 3 drops, what's the big deal? If you had about 1 cigarette's worth of tobacco in your little jar of bitters that you infused into it, really you have 1 whole pack of cigarettes worth of nicotine in that same little dropper of bitters. Now that doesn't seem so harmless anymore. That's a lot more. And people that I know in the bar industry, I had one bartender friend from Hawaii, she put on Facebook, I don't know what's wrong with me, but every time I have a drink with tobacco in it, I get sick afterwards. And I was like, I know what's wrong with you. You're drinking poison and then doing it again. Particularly, she's a very low-weight person, so felt the impacts very strongly. But it's a real issue that tobacco can affect a person at even these low doses used in cocktails. Luckily, if you have tobacco on your menu, you can just switch it out today. I use Lapsang Souchong tea because it has that smoky flavor to it, and a lot of people go right to that substitute. It's pretty much the most popular way that people use tobacco flavor in cocktails. And speaking of tobacco versus tobacco flavor, there was a well-known bar in the US, and going back probably 8 years ago, they put something like a cigar old-fashioned on the menu, and it was a very big seller. It was labeled as having whiskey, sugar, and tobacco bitters in it. The management of this bar was smart enough not to actually put tobacco in their tobacco bitters, but just to give the taste of tobacco. The problem, so they didn't themselves poison a single customer, but every bartender in town came and had this drink. A lot of customers came, and they're like, great, I'm going to go home and make my own tobacco infusion at home. And so many people made themselves ill being inspired by just the way a menu was written that inspired people to use unsafe ingredients. And I think that's something super not obvious that we might inspire people to do, because also inspiring people to poison themselves is not great hospitality. So, and a special note, while we're here in Berlin, we can go to talks this week on, longevity in your career, health and wellness, doing some yoga, going to a safety seminar. And then we go to the bars at night, and everyone allows smoking. It's kind of crazy. If we really want to consider wellness as a goal, something to move towards, I hope that some bar owners and bartenders will help move the needle and a push towards disallowing smoking in their bars. I do think it's an important movement that the industry can make in the parts of the world where there still is smoking, for your customers and for yourselves, particularly for yourselves. In San Francisco, where there has been no smoking in bars for over 20 years now, the law was written as a employee protection law. It wasn't about whether customers wanted to smoke in the bar. It was about whether the bartenders had to endure the smoke of customers in the bar. And that's the way that it came into play. Okay, so the next set of ingredients that we're going to talk about are banned basically by name in the United States. So there's no amount that you are allowed to use. However, in the European Union, the laws are written smarter than they are in the US. They're saying the ingredient is fine, it's the active chemical in the ingredient that's problematic. So we'll just limit that. So we'll start with coumarin. Coumarin is it's a compound found in both bison grass, for bison grass vodka, and in tonka beans. And in the United States, we don't get to have tonka beans. They are illegal, and it is a shame because they smell so good. But the coumarin is toxic to the liver in high doses. So tonka bean infusions might not be such a great idea, no matter what part of the world you live in, to a point. Also, sweet woodruff is something that's used in some, I believe, vermouths, and that contains coumarin as well and is regulated. But we also get a lot of coumarin sort of by accident with cassia cinnamon, as opposed to the Ceylon cinnamon, I think is the regular one. It's just, we do eat it naturally. And we find that to be the case with a lot of ingredients that are controlled, that some botanicals that have it are regulated and some are not. And it's just a matter of dosage. The high level of coumarin would be in the tonka green beans and the bison grass. So this is a number slide, and remember, as I said earlier on, this is all on the website. You can look up the coumarin page / tonka bean page and find these details. No need to get tired writing about them. But just to point out that they are illegal in the US and limited in Europe to certain amounts. And then for most of these examples, I have a few ideas about things you might do to replace them if you wanted something slightly safer. Coumarin, I just kind of made this up based on what I think tonka bean smells like. Sort of vanilla-y, sort of pheromone-y, like myrrh has that perfumey smell, and a little cinnamon in it. I don't know. Something you could try. You're the experts. Bitter almonds. Bitter almonds, of course, are in Amaretto, which means little bitter. But in today's Amaretto, they don't use the actual nuts. They use the pits of stone fruit, mostly apricots, peaches, and cherries. And they all contain a cyanide precursor called amygdalin. And if you've seen old black and white film noir murder mystery movies, they're like, well, the dead person's breath smelled like almonds, therefore he was poisoned by cyanide. That's how we know it. And there's a strong association of cyanide poisoning with almond flavors. Some people these days are eating apricot pits because there's a belief that they cure cancer, which they do not. Don't do it. You'll tend to, even if your cancer was cured, you'll die of cyanide poisoning. So, one or the other. In the US, you're not allowed to use bitter almonds unless they have their hydrogen cyanide precursor removed from them. Whereas in the EU, there are upper limits put on those ingredients. we do have a little bit better information than with most botanicals I'm going to talk about today, about like, well, how much will it take to kill you? Because that's the question we always want to know. According to some EU websites, 3 raw apricot kernels would be enough to put you over the legal limit of how much cyanide you could take into your system. But once you get towards 20 and 30 kernels infused into alcohol, that's going to send you to the hospital, potentially life-threatening at those levels, infused into a jar. So if we look then at our Amaretto recipe from Pinterest, we find that that's definitely so much poison if those are really bitter almonds in that jar. Not okay to use. For alternatives to bitter almonds, we can, of course, use regular almonds, sweet almonds, or cyanide-removed bitter almond oils. Or you could try, it wouldn't really be a true amaretto, but using other nuts if you're trying to achieve a similar nutty flavor profile. From sassafras, I don't know how common of an ingredient that is over here, but sassafras was the traditional root beer and tea often consumed by Native Americans. And it is not legal to use in the United States at all anymore. Because it is thought to cause liver damage and cancer. Now, in the US, all sassafras can't have any safrole in it, which basically means you can't use sassafras whatsoever. Where, again, the EU has the more sensible laws of a limited amount of safrole that can be in any ingredient. There are easy alternatives to sassafras. That's the great thing. I just the other day bought a big bag of sarsaparilla, which sounds like the most American thing I could say. Sarsaparilla! And it smells fantastic. It itself smells like this wintergreen and vanilla notes. Other recipes for homemade root beer add birch bark to the mix of that. I haven't tried it, but I might, because I'm inspired by sarsaparilla. Now, calamus is an ingredient a lot of us don't know about. We don't talk about it used behind the bar very much, but it's important to know because if we look at most vintage recipes for vermouths and bitters and amari, and any recipe I've ever seen for a homemade Campari substitute includes calamus as an ingredient. And calamus is actually used in vermouths today that are on the market, as long as those are not for sale for the US, where it's completely forbidden by name. Calamus contains something called beta-acerone, and it is definitely carcinogenic at higher levels. And in the EU, it's limited to how much of the beta-acerone can be in your final product. Now, there are safer varieties of calamus that exist in the world. However, should you go online to attempt to purchase those, there's no way to tell which calamus that you're getting. When we buy botanicals, they don't say, oh, it contains this much calamus, contains this much beta-acerone. That's the unfortunate problem with buying raw herbs as they are. So even though the calamus you might find online for sale is labeled like, use this much in a tea, it's the one that's going to have beta-acerone, not the free version of that. I have not smelled calamus on its own, but according to the Miscellany Guide to Vermouth, you can get a substitute with a combination of cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger. Sounds amazing. I actually have a bag of calamus on order being sent to my house, which I will not consume because it could be dangerous. Next up, thujone. So, absinthe. Thujone is the worrisome, dangerous ingredient in wormwood, and therefore people blame the problems with absinthism on the thujone. Now, it is highly toxic at high levels. There was a case in the US where a person bought a concentrated wormwood oil thinking he was going to drink some absinthe and basically did it as a shot. Woke up in the hospital where he remained for several weeks to save his life because his liver stopped functioning. But on smaller levels, of course, it is legal to use. We also find the thujone in tansy and yarrow, which those are used separately in different ingredients for spirits. and Amari. And in the US, they call out if any of these ingredients are in your product, then you must have it professionally tested by a laboratory to be sure it's under the safe limit of thujone. Now, in the US, it's 10 parts per million, which is basically legally negligible amounts. So they're saying, we define no thujone as less than 10. Other countries are a little bit more generous with what they allow you in, depending on the product. As we can see here, the European levels are all there. Again, this is all on cocktailsafe.org as well. So if we wanted to use something else, I was thinking, find another bitter herb to use other than wormwood. Now, hops doesn't at all smell or taste that much like wormwood, but if you're trying to get something that's bitter and herbaceous, these are some suggestions that I just made up 2 days ago. So a point to discuss now. I've been talking about all these limited ingredients and, you can use up to 0.1 or 5 milligrams or whatever parts per million of the dangerous part of the ingredients. But if you're behind the bar, you want to make a syrup of sassafras, how do you know when you hit the limit of what is legal according to the government? The problem is that we don't. You have to send it to a lab to find out. Botanicals are not all that consistent, at least not the botanicals that we can find available for sale in not massive distillation quantities. The way a commercial producer might use these ingredients, such as wormwood, would be to infuse wormwood into alcohol and let it sit, take out the wormwood, send it to the lab, and now they can dilute or use less or more depending on the tested limit of that product. We don't have the luxury of that behind the bar. So the consideration there is whether it's a good idea to use any ingredient when we don't know for sure that we're using the safe amount of that ingredient. So theoretically, say you go ahead and say, I want to make wormwood syrup. I know wormwood is in commercial products. I like how it smells and tastes. I don't think this is a dangerous amount, and I want to use it, so I'm going to serve that at my bar. In theory, the food inspector, health inspector could come to the bar and say, show me your recipe for these bitters or whatever that have wormwood, and no, I don't believe those are safe. From what I understand about the qualifications for most food inspectors working in the world today, not much of a danger of that really happening. But I think the bigger issue, and essentially the most important point of this whole talk, is you saying, I like wormwood, I want to use it, I think it's safe, I haven't killed anyone yet, I'm going to put it in my drink. That whole line of decision-making was about you. There was no customer involved in that. Nobody asked you to dose them with wormwood. A customer comes to a bar with an expectation that they're going to be consuming alcohol, but they're not coming with an expectation that they're going to be involved in your dangerous and illegal experiment behind the bar. That's what I want us to keep in mind as we move towards using safer ingredients than we might be using now. We can do better than what we're doing, and let's not have it be about us and what we want to do and what we want to make. Make your own wormwood syrup at home and drink yourself into a coma. I don't care, but it's probably we don't want to do that to a customer who really didn't sign up for that. Okay, so we're going to move on to some ingredients that are limited in quantity in the US as well as in Europe. So as I assume probably everyone here knows, tonic water is quinine-flavored soda. Quinine is the isolated chemical compound from a cinchona tree bark native to Peru and Bolivia. It was a cure for malaria for more than 350 years, and we just grew to like the taste of it, so now we drink it with our gin and tonic. But the quinine can cause problems. Oh, by the way, we don't talk about it much. We talk about our quinine in our tonic water, but quinine is in almost every Italian Amaro that's on the market, because most of those classic brands came out in the middle of the 1800s when cinchona bark was still really the only cure for malaria. So those early Amari were pretty much all anti-cholera, like cure-all medicines. And so they pretty much all have quinine in them, as well as some fortified quinine wines. The US has different limit than Europe. I want to check that Europe number just because it seems really high, but that's what I looked up initially. What there is to know is that it is regulated. But what happens when we have too much quinine or too much cinchona bark gives you cinchonitis. The main symptoms of it sound like a really bad hangover after going to a Metallica concert. A swollen head, tinnitus, a ringing in the ears, and muscle pain in the joints and extremities. And a lot of bartenders and producers who've been trying to make their own tonic syrups at the bar have come down with these conditions. It's not theoretical poison, it's real stuff that's impacting a lot of bartenders, particularly people who are developing recipes and tasting over and over again. So cinchonitis is, that's the low end of that scale. But on a more extreme level, it can cause all sorts of heart conditions because it sort of stills shaking, and that's why it was good against fevers and malaria, but it also can still your heart, which is not good. When the quinine in tonic water, it's usually purified quinine sulfate, so it's, we only have to worry about quinine as the danger. But when whole bark is used, there's also quinidine in it. And quinidine, turns out, might be more impactful, even at lower levels, to people with a certain heart condition. These people may or may not know that they have it. But by estimations of if you use the highest quantity quinine-containing bark, and you use a recipe that used tons of this bark in the recipe, and you didn't filter your syrup at all, so this is a lot of ifs, then we could reach the level that's not at the legal level right from the get-go, but particularly for the quinidine content, not even at the safe level for a customer coming into the bar and maybe having 2 of the drink for a very small amount of the population. So I don't think I'm going to convince too many people to stop making tonic bark if you're making but people love that homemade tonic syrup. I mean, I don't love a brown gin and tonic, but that's just me. But my recommendation is to keep the chunky bits out of your homemade tonic syrup. To use not the powdered cinchona bark, which you can buy, but the bark chips. Treat it like a tea and filter it out at the end so we don't have those lingering solids which will stay in the system and can impact, particularly if one is testing the recipe day after day after day. We could also look at other flavoring alternatives if we were going to make a tonic-like syrup, such as gentian and rhubarb, which are commonly used in Amari along with quinine, as well as other barks, like birch and cherry and Angostura bark, often used in bitters themselves. More of a fun fact about licorice. Who knew licorice is dangerous? Licorice, it's more about people drinking licorice tea every day, all day, for a month. It can rob potassium and cause paralysis. Really, that's a long-term danger, and there are laws written about the legal limits of glycyrrhizin that you can have. Now say it with me now. Glycyrrhizin. Great job, everyone. And about how much can be used in drinks. That's not a major problem that most of us would run into on a day-to-day basis. But if you're looking at that licorice root for its sweetening properties, we could look at other alternatives, such as marshmallow root or stevia, neither of which I've experimented with, but that's a suggestion. Those were ingredients, and now we'll move on to some techniques. Okay, fat washing. Most of us know fat washing is a process where we infuse something fatty into alcohol, such as pork fat or a pork chop, let it infuse for a few hours, put it in the freezer, and then let the fatty parts freeze, come to solids, and scrape those off. The body of the spirit retains a little bit of the greasiness from the fat, as well as the flavor of the fatty ingredient. However, now that we've done that, we're not safe yet because there's still some of that fat into the base spirit. We have to worry about botulism here. You may have heard of examples where people made olive oil infused with garlic and died of botulism toxin poisoning. It's happened kind of a lot around the world. And that's kind of what we're dealing with here. The oil that's floating on top of our fat wash spirit can go rancid. So in general, what we want to do is a fat wash spirit, just treat it like we treat the meat itself. You wouldn't leave a pork chop on the counter overnight and eat it in the morning, although maybe tomorrow morning half of you would. But we want to avoid keeping it at room temperature. We want to refrigerate it as you would a meat that you're going to eat, as well as paying attention to the containers that you use, such as if you're chopping meat on a cutting board, you don't then the next day put vegetables on it and continue to use it for like that. For the same reason, you wouldn't necessarily put your bacon fat-washed old-fashioned on tap because you've got those tap lines to worry about having air in them and botulism toxin happening and killing everybody in the bar. Not a good idea. Not good hospitality to murder all your customers. So, again, treat it like you treat the meat. Particularly all citrus, really, we should be washing it. I know most people don't, but as you cut through a piece of citrus, you're dragging anything that's on the surface of that into the middle before you juice it. That's the concern. But particularly for citrus, a lot of bars have the bowl of citrus on top of the bar that you're going to zest onto the drinks or maybe flame onto the drinks. And I think we all know if you see that if the stickers from the grocery store are still on that citrus, we know to like get a bottled beer instead because that's not a bar to drink in. They've shown you that they didn't wash their citrus. Citrus can be coated with petroleum-based wax if it's not organic, and organic-based wax if it is. The US government specifically says you don't need to wash it with any special soap. Really, we're talking about rinsing our citrus that we're going to use for flaming. And if that's not scary enough, this story came out in the New York Times saying farmers are now spraying antibiotics on citrus crops. Yikes. Wash your citrus, please. For my sake. Okay, another item to mention is food-safe containers. I think probably most of us here have batched in something we shouldn't have batched in technically at one point. I have used like the sand pail from the dollar store myself at home, so I'm guilty too. Vintage tiki mugs made before 1970 may or may not have lead glaze in them. Lead crystal decanters are a particular problem because we tend to store alcohol in them, high-proof alcohol, and that can actually leach lead from certain lead crystal decanters. And then technically, unlined copper mugs, if there's anything citric acidic in the drink, such as the lime juice in a Moscow Mule, it can interact with the copper. Now, most of the problems are not over the course of having a single drink, a single night at a bar. They're for long-term storage of higher proof alcohol, where we might find more impacts, real impacts of using these containers. Again, we're just sliding up the safety scale towards safe and legal if possible. Some wacky people over in London were aging some spirits in leather. If you decide to replicate that, there is chrome tanned leather, which is extremely not okay to use, and vegetable tanned leather, which people are using it. There's no science on like, should I put my cocktail in this leather bag? Yeah, no one thought of that at the government inspection office until they were doing it at the Artesian. But so just be sure any leather that goes anywhere near food that it is vegetable tanned leather. Liquid nitrogen. Now, many have heard the story. A woman on her 18th birthday was given a shot of alcohol and it still had liquid nitrogen fizzing away in it. Did the shot. Of course, the cold temperatures of the liquid nitrogen seared the whole throat lining, but then as the liquid turns from liquid to gas, there's a massive expansion. So think of that happening inside of you and how horribly painful that would be of this expansion. This woman had to have her stomach removed, which I think is like getting a non-consensual gastric bypass surgery is what happened there. Luckily, she survived, but we never want to give a person the chance to grab something and poison themselves from the bar. And I think that's what liquid nitrogen handling is all about. Same with dry ice, really. If it's fun, if it's still fizzing away in the drink, and we would think that a customer wouldn't just swallow that, but of course they're going to. I mean, I've done it. But other things about liquid nitrogen handling, beyond if you're like, okay, I'm safe, I'm not serving it to customers, and if you're using gloves and treating it with caution, then that's not the only problems to be aware of. Liquid nitrogen is going to displace the oxygen in the air as it fizzes off, and that can cause a low oxygen environment, therefore asphyxiation. And this can happen in rooms where there's not good ventilation, if we're storing the liquid nitrogen in a broom closet, for example. As well as because of that expansion factor, you see liquid nitrogen being transported in thermoses, but those thermoses have vents in them that allow, when it's warmed up, the gas to escape. Because if you took a regular school thermos, fill it with your liquid nitrogen, and seal the cap on, as that warms up a little bit in that thermos, the gas is going to expand and it can't escape. You've created a bomb there, and I'm not here to tell you how to build bombs. That's next year's seminar. But these are just things to be aware of when dealing with it, that not only the bartenders who are using liquid nitrogen at the bar should be trained on particularly the asphyxiation and transport factors, but every single person who works behind that bar, that means the barbacks and that means the maintenance staff, should know these things because these can really hurt bystanders without them knowing. Dry ice for the same reason. It's a lot less intense, but what has happened more often with dry ice, this happens in California a lot, and it's all because of Burning Man. So people load up their trunk with all their food for the week, and they have dry ice to keep it cold. This sometimes can happen with batch cocktails and going to festivals as well. The dry ice sublimates, fills the car with carbon dioxide, and the driver of the car passes out and steers into a ditch. This has happened a few times, so it's all about ventilation with these things. Finally, we get to problems created by Instagram, activated charcoal. So many people are dyeing drinks black because they look great on the internet, and activated charcoal is a thing people are going to more often than carbon black, as it's called, in Europe where it is legal. Carbon black is basically, burnt vegetation that you can use as a food coloring, and it's okay over here, not in the US. Activated charcoal or activated carbon is prepared in a way that it's very porous, and what it does is it sticks to chemical compounds that it gets in contact with and traps them, sort of like a fly trap. And it's used for drug overdoses in the hospital. So if you've taken too much whatever, go to the hospital, not alcohol because it doesn't impact it. If you take too much ibuprofen and you're in the hospital, you'll be given activated charcoal. The chemicals will stick to it, and then instead of filtering into your bloodstream, just pass out with the activated charcoal stuck to that. So it's a way of preventing things of getting into the bloodstream. People associate activated charcoal with health movements because there are traditions of using activated charcoal for health and wellness that go back hundreds of years before modern pharmacy, and without people preparing that these will come up against pharmaceuticals that people want in their system. So the danger here with using activated charcoal, in particular in a drink, is that a customer can come into the bar and they've just taken their heart medication or their birth control pill or their antidepressant, and if they consume that cocktail within a couple hours before or after of the medication that they're taking, it could deactivate their necessary medication. And we certainly don't want to do that. We never want to mess with a customer's medication. That's not what they signed up for. And here in Europe, in particular, you can use other black food coloring, the carbon black instead. So you don't want the activated charcoal as your black coloring to use. A lot of people are using cuttlefish ink or squid ink to get that nice black color. Not vegetarian, worth noting on the menu. Some people black sesame seeds, although they're kind of grayish when you squish them up and use them in a drink. Black currants, or just black food coloring. Now, if you think that your bar program is too fancy or old school to use food coloring in a drink, well, if you're using blue curacao or Campari or Aperol, you're already using artificial coloring in your drink. So it's not that big of a stretch to go ahead and use black food coloring in them. You can call it a black color infusion on the menu. No one will know. A couple ingredients to mention that are not usually specifically illegal, but just to be aware of. Oxalic acid, which is found particularly in wood sorrel, or oxalis, it's sometimes called, as well as rhubarb leaves. So wood sorrel is safe to eat. You can buy it to use in salads and things. It's at a level of you're going to make a juice out of it that it's quite bad for you with the oxalic acid. When rhubarb is used in the cocktail situation, the leaves are just not for sale because they are dangerous. When we eat it in food, it's the red stalks that we're able to buy in the grocery store. And then rhubarb liqueurs, such as sfumato and zucca, are actually made with a root of rhubarb and for a quite different flavor profile. But stay away from the leaves. Another Instagram-related issue can be bright, tropical, colorful flowers. All of the Instagrammers in LA are constantly putting poisonous flowers into their drinks and putting them online and being like, I'm so skinny, and getting 1,000 likes. And then the botanists start chiming in like, hey, well, you're going to be dead in 5 hours if you don't get to the hospital. But just because, I think we know that you don't go to a florist and expect to be able to use those cocktail in your drinks. So they may have pesticides and insecticides and even coloring added to them. But that doesn't mean that any flower that you find in nature is automatically safe to put in a drink. I mean, certainly, again, poison ivy is not safe to put in a drink, and that's perfectly organic. So we just want to check that any flower that you use is safe to use in a drink. You can buy edible flowers. That's the easy way. But for foraged flowers, we want to double check somewhere online that they are safe. Wow. I don't understand German. I'm like, okay, so we're big into the environment and reusing ingredients. Oh my gosh. 6 p.m., got it. I understood that part. Happy hour, House of Rum, 6 p.m. As soon as this talk is over. Okay, so when we look at making things like avocado pit orgeat, which the Trash Tiki folks are doing, or using tomato leaves and flowers and other parts of botanicals that we use every day that are safe, we need to reinvestigate whether specific parts of those plants are safe. We've talked about apricot pits, not okay to use. Apricots are fine. The flowers and stems of different plants are safer or less safe. Rhubarb, different parts of that plant are totally not safe or great to use. I mentioned foraged ingredients before. We know not to go into the forest and eat every mushroom that we find in the dirt, but there are other ingredients to be aware of as well, including certain types of ferns, elderberry as opposed to elderflower, and even not all kinds of juniper are safe to eat. So go with an expert. One thing I mentioned, if we go into a bar and we see someone using a dangerous ingredient, a lot of people, well, what I hope you wouldn't do is go to TripAdvisor or Yelp and be like, this is the worst bar in the world. This monster is trying to kill you all with Wormwood or whatever. I find that when we accuse someone, well, that's also just because TripAdvisor is the devil, but that when you yell at someone doing something that we think is unsafe, it might be less effective at getting the situation corrected rather than providing someone an opportunity to learn what they did and how to improve it. Hey, I see you're using tobacco bitters at your bar. If that's real tobacco, I read this website, send link to Cocktail Safe, where I found it's super dangerous, and you can just use Lapsang Souchong tea instead. So I hope you check it out. That's a way that I found to be more effective at getting a bar to actually change. Allow the bartenders to read the site, educate themselves, and be like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to poison people anymore. And you're like, great, good job. It's all on you. So that is personal advice. Just 2 notes on ingredients that I think deserve better labeling on the cocktail menu. We all know nut allergies can be very severe in certain people, but those certain people may not know that there are nuts in falernum and orgeat in particular, but they sort of can be hidden behind a word that consumers may not know about. This is particularly the case in tourist areas where we have less educated drinkers. So my recommendation is if there are nuts in the drink, to have the nut name specifically on the menu. You might call it almond falernum, or you might have a little star and say contains nuts somewhere. I think that's even mandatory in some parts of Europe, not so in the US. The other one that a lot of people don't know about is grapefruit. Now, grapefruit's not an allergen per se, but it interacts with so many very common medications. And you'll get your jar of pills and it say on the side, never take with grapefruit. So this is something that's not a dangerous ingredient in itself, but one that people will know that they can't have. So I just want to let bartenders know, if there's grapefruit in the drink, it's good to have the word on the menu, not like blend of citrus, like some tiki bars may use, or like saying just bitters as opposed to grapefruit bitters. If there's grapefruit in the drink, I think it's a good idea to have it listed on the menu. And now we actually have time for questions, if there are any. And there are usually a lot, and I usually can't answer almost all of them.
With the move towards sort of gastronomy...
Can you speak louder?
Sorry, with the move towards gastronomy and stuff, can you speak to people using rotavats and distillation in the bar? And what herbs are and aren't sort of a good to go to?
It's a good question. So using a rotovap, well, we're certainly, I guess the worry in general is that we're concentrating. Any distillation is usually a concentration. For example, people making... if you were distilling beer into spirits, we would know to make heads and tails cuts. And with potentially dangerous ingredients, I would assume that might come into play. I don't have the particular expertise to say about anything specific in that I can think of. Other than if you can afford a rotovap, like get the test of how much of the stuff you put in. We have a comment to the question if you want to. Oh, someone else has the mic, sorry.
I have the mic. I'm right here. I had a question. I noticed twice you listed aquafaba as a dangerous ingredient. Is it just because it's an allergen, because it's a legume, or?
Yeah, some people are allergic to legumes, and so I consider that more of an allergen than a danger, or maybe might deserve more clarification on the menu, depending on the customer base. Like, contains legumes, or call it chickpea water or something like that. I don't know of any danger beyond that.
Okay, thank you. That was it.
So something I learned, not from looking up recipes on Pinterest, but just bumbling around a tea shop that had cinchona bark and other things, reishi mushrooms in jars. Some of those ingredients taste delicious in drinks, but then I learned that some are maybe dangerous when extracted with alcohol versus hot water. So I guess my question is, where's the best reference? Is it cocktailsafe.org? Are there other ways for us to know what's safe and what's the best resource for that information, I guess, is my question.
Well, a lot of the resources that I use for Cocktail Safe, the first thing I did was to go see, is this ingredient regulated? Because that means the government acknowledges it as particularly unsafe. And so I went to government websites, and then for every ingredient that was in question, I just essentially Google ingredient name danger and ingredient name safe, and not just count the number of results, but I then read those sites. The word danger usually brings up better information than safe. What's interesting is with some of these, with a lot of plants, there's better information about how toxic they are to dogs and cats and horses than there are to humans, because I guess you have easy test subjects who are like, my dog ate this and died. You're like, okay, that's probably poisonous to dogs, so good to know for humans. I also use some herbal sort of botanical books that I took out from the library, which I found to be inconsistent as far as their quality. Some are like, this will align the 7th chakra. I'm like, thanks, great info. But will it kill me? So I looked in some of those, but really just thorough online research was how I built what I could. And I don't claim that Cocktail Safe, the website, has every ingredient, but I also try to list the ones that I researched and couldn't find anything dangerous about them. Because the questions that I often get from seminars like, oh, I never thought of using catnip in a cocktail, but apparently bartenders in Pittsburgh are all about it. So that's on my list of things to look up later. Catnip. Who knew? Other questions?
Any other questions? We can come to you with the mic. All right.
Yeah. Here's someone who might know something about food safety. Well, you'll be next.
You had elderberries on the list. What was wrong with elderberries?
They can be toxic at certain doses, as opposed to elderflowers. And I feel like they're okay at lower doses, but offhand I don't remember.
Okay, just I've got old books on country wines, like making wines from fruits, and there are recipes in there for wine made just out of elderberries. So. But it doesn't mean just because it's old that it's good.
Oh, we have a winner. Someone's taken the take-home message there. Yeah, offhand I don't remember why it got on that slide, but I know I have looked it up and found it to be called out as a dangerous ingredient.
Yeah, I just wanted to react to your question about the Rotavap. I'm a distiller. And what we do, like from some substances, we know that they are volatile. So then it's dangerous because it will come into the distillate. And some we know they're not. Like, for example, allergens. They're proteins. They're huge molecules. They won't evaporate. So allergens don't end up in a distillate. That's like a basic rule. So allergens you don't have to worry about in a distillate. So you can safely eat nuts when you distill them, even though you have a nut allergy. But what we do in general, because even though I'm a food technician, even we don't always know. And you can't find the information anywhere. You can look up the boiling point. That gives a clue. If the boiling point is above 300, well, then you know it won't end up. But what we do is, like he said, have it analyzed at a laboratory. Like, for example, cyanide is volatile, so it will end up.
Ah.
So we will have the distillate from kernels, like sloe gin, the sloe fruit. The kernels have cyanide, but we do distill sloes, but then we have it analyzed to make sure it's safe. So you don't always know. So sometimes analyzation in a laboratory is the only clue, but there are basic rules, like look up the boiling point, and if it's a protein, you're safe as well.
Right.
Like gluten or nuts.
Yeah, I do. I've done another talk about allergen safety, and that was the real big point that we learned. Like, when you distill it, allergens are proteins are the allergens, and they don't come over in a clean distillation. It would be anything you added after distillation that would pop up. So that's sort of good to keep in mind when it comes to nuts and gin and gluten products, etc. Any further questions, or was that about it? Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camper English. And if anyone has any further questions or anything you want to add on, come grab him before he gets off the stage. Thank you. As usual, if you came in with a bottle or a glass or a box, please pick it up and throw it away in the trash cans that are at the end of the room or outside of the room. Thank you very much for your cooperation.